When the first Earthworm Jim stormed the market in 1994, it was met with a huge amount of critical and commercial success. It was developed by Shiny Entertainment, a brand new studio that was funded by Playmates Toys and made up of former Virgin Games programmers. Shiny's president Dave Perry had been responsible for games like ALADDIN, so there was a ton of hype behind his new company and their upcoming games. With Earthworm Jim done and a bona fide hit, Shiny immediately turned their attention to a sequel to be released the following year in 1995. That too received a ton of praise and sold well, helping to keep an aging 16-bit market strong and profitable. With the release of the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, the demand for games for those systems had been incredible. Hoping to cash in further on their new game's success, Shiny Entertainment enlisted the services of Screaming Pink to port Earthworm Jim 2 to the new 32-bit consoles. In this episode, we'll be looking at the Saturn version, check out some of the upgrades it received, and see if it's worth adding to your collection. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Earthworm Jim 2 for the Sega Saturn. The gameplay of Earthworm Jim 2 is a mix of the familiar run-and-gun action of the first, as well as a bunch of new elements to keep things fresh. Some stages completely change the formula entirely, giving you completely new objectives that almost make it feel like a hybrid of half a dozen different genres. Sometimes you will be saving puppies by keeping them airborne, sometimes you will need to float your way to victory, sometimes dig yourself out of trouble, and sometimes you'll be lost in the dark disguised as a completely different character. When Jim is shooting at things, he now has a bunch of new weapons as well as something called a snot swing that you can use at various places within the level. Boss encounters try and be as different as the stages themselves, often having you doing some very untraditional things. The final battle itself is a foot race, for instance. Despite the gameplay going in a bunch of different directions, the story follows the first pretty closely, and that dastardly Psycro returns and kidnaps Princess What's-Her-Name yet again. Jim's job is to rescue her and save the day. Finally, there is a password system in place to return to your previously played locations. Much like the first, the original 16-bit versions of this game had been fairly impressive in regards to animation and special effects. Part 2 had been on a 24 megabit card originally, and Shiny filled it to the brim with some of the best animation seen on the Genesis platform. Screaming Pink must have been impressed with it themselves, because they left much of the sprite and foreground work virtually untouched. What they did change were many of the game's backgrounds. And I don't mean an extra layer of parallax scrolling and a bit more color, I mean they went all out and drastically changed the entire look and feel of them. There are a few stages that received some additional effects like transparencies, but overall most look quite different than they did before. Despite these additions, everything else is much the same. The animation appears untouched, effects like smoke and weapon fire are identical, and most everything else still carries a 16-bit look and feel. Needless to say, this port aimed to stay faithful to the original vision. Prior to Screaming Pink's work here, a company called Rainbow Arts had ported this to the PC and remixed the soundtrack. That new soundtrack was used for the Saturn version, and while it's nothing truly impressive, it does still fit the game overall. The sound effects are of a higher quality as well, so it definitely benefits from the newer hardware in this area. Let's take a listen to a few of the stages. Oh man, where to begin on my feelings for this one? Before I say another word, I want you to know I appreciate this for what it is. The core of this experience is a fine game, and on the Genesis, I would have nothing but good things to say about it. The variety it presents was heads and tails above what you normally saw that generation, and I think it deserves a heap of praise for that. But in 1996, on game machines that were infinitely more capable, Earthworm Jim 2 isn't nearly as impressive. Even the new backgrounds don't really present anything the Genesis couldn't have pulled off itself, and the lack of additional content is puzzling to say the least. This could have been really spruced up on the Saturn and given a facelift and a few extra levels that could have really made a difference. They even got the little things wrong. How does a 32-bit game in 1996 still use a password system instead of saves? And that marks the biggest failing of this. There is really no reason to own it over the 16-bit versions, an outcome that is particularly tragic on the Saturn considering its immense 2D capabilities. The quagmire in reviewing a game like this is that it still plays great and the design is still exceptional. For those reasons, I can still recommend it as a game that is very much worth playing. But let's be clear, this does not use or show off what this fine console was capable of. It's a port of little consequence, and given the choice, you are missing very little should you decide to skip it. There was a stigma in the West when it came to 2D games on 32-bit platforms. 3D polygons had become the driving force of the industry, and the old technology was seen by many as outdated and unwanted. Ports like this only supported that thinking. Why would customers flock to this when so little of it was different from before? The PlayStation version of it was only released in Europe, where it was absolutely panned by the gaming media of the time. The Saturn version was met with reservations as well. Next Generation and Sega Saturn magazine both gave it middling reviews, praising its gameplay but critiquing its lack of visual upgrades. I really can't help but to agree with them. Releases like this really were a head scratcher. To not use all that extra power, color, and effects was a big downer, and paying a premium to play the same game all over again wasn't very appealing. Make no mistake, however, if you have never played this one before, the Saturn is a fine platform to do it on. The gameplay variety is top-notch, and it's a great experience. If you are familiar with this one, however, it offers very little in the way of reasons to revisit it. The new music and backgrounds just aren't compelling enough, and the lack of additional content like stages is just plain surprising. I believe firmly that 2D games could still sell even in that market had they been given something special, but bare-bones efforts like these simply weren't gonna cut it. I'm Sega LORENZO'S. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.